Good morning, everyone. Let me just refresh my microphone in case that ruined itself, but now it should be okay if it was. And let's do the same for the camera. Ooh, my light isn't on. I was all dark and mysterious. Let's go with that. Let's turn that down a little today. Whew. Day 13. 13 days. 13 days of doing this. Okay. If you're around, please drop a message in the chat to let me know that the audio is okay and that everything's fine, that I'm not alone in the world, and in fact, I have many friends who will love me very much and validate me with my talent. No, just one person, just probably that one person who I'm now suspecting might be a bot rather than a regular human coward. It's now an electronic coward. Who knows? Yes, I am drinking a Monster. Yes, it is 8:30 at night. And yes, I am stoked to read The Immortalist by Alan Harrington, chapters 17 and 18. Stream looks like it's a couple of seconds behind today. Looking at that little preview video, have I... Oh, I've left it on normal latency. Lame. How sad. Okay. A 0-person start again. That would be fun. Well, one viewer bot. Okay. Let us begin. Because it's for the practice, not for the people. Right. 2034. 2034. And not just 4. Let's do that. So, should we get another minute? Yeah. Oh, somebody else joined. Fantastic. Who is this going to be? Please put a message in the chat. please validate me. I'm so warm. I feel like I've been really warm the last few days. The heating I haven't found the right level for. I'm either really cold or really warm. Maybe it's because I'm still a little bit unwell. Who knows? Who knows? Okay. Oh, it's Martin. Who do you hope? Smiley face. Oh, I would have anybody. My stream is a little bit delayed today because I accidentally put it on normal latency rather than like whatever it is, ultra fast. So it's gonna ultra low latency, sorry. But it's on normal. So there is a couple of seconds delay between me seeing the chat and me being able to respond. So I might get lost in question and answers. So I'll try to read the messages. Okay. I'm gonna get into it. I'm gonna change this number to a 5. So I was gonna get into it a minute ago. Please like the stream if you like it. Okay. Chapter 17. State of the Biomedical Arts. I believe we can be masters of our fate. Dr. Glenn T. Seaborg. I am a great believer in the idea of man I'm a great believer in the idea of whatever man can imagine, man can do. Michael E. DeBakey, MD. We are being carried away in the direction of immortality and the divine state on a river of assembled information and discovery. The trickle started in Babylon and Egypt, nothing to disturb the gods. In the 4th millennium BC, cumulative records appeared in the valleys of Mesopotamia, cuneiform inscription, wedge writing, water and sun clocks. Because of the Nile floods, annual remeasurement of the fields of Egypt, and geometry begins. In the valley of Euphrates, disemboweling of animals for food and studying their entrails for divination eventually informs Sir William Osler and Dr. Christian Barnard. Currents of speculation run together and are confirmed. They begin to move more swiftly and turbulently. Now the gods of our inventions grow dimly aware of the direction in which this life force is moving. Alarmed, they intervene. The flow is dammed by repression, confined in backwaters of superstition and ignorance. Sometimes it is forced underground, but soon, within 1,000 years, the stream has been unified into a single method. It can no longer be contained. Now it is all burst above ground. An enormous river of input rolls over us. Everyone knows the truism that most people who have ever worked in science are alive today. Growing numbers of them are issuing creative research papers of every description, so that we have a flood of information beyond our capacity to absorb. In practical terms, this means that specialists in a given discipline must carry on their own work, then, after hours, find time to track down and review numberless projects of others, an exhausting professional effort. How many engineers and scientists have wished that the river could temporarily be shut off, so that we might take time to pool our knowledge, put it in order, see what we have, and determine in what direction future study ought to be orientated. But often the professional will not be able to manage such a review. Desperately we command computers. Computers may ease overflow of physics data for students. The New York Times, 28th of the 1st, 68. The American Institute of Physics announced yesterday the start of $1 million project to explore ways to overcome the growing traffic jam in physics information. It had become increasingly difficult for a physicist working in the area that overlaps a number of these fields to keep informed of developments that bear on his research. To do so means reading more literature than is feasible. One idea being discussed as perhaps the ultimate solution is the creation of a computerized system that provides each scientist only with the information bearing directly on his work. In subscribing to this service, he would, by filling out forms, tell the computer what lines of research concerned him. In the pursuit of immortality, now beginning to surface, the biomedical arts may be found in similar confusion. Hence, in this and other master disciplines, the computer has evolved into today's most conspicuous Renaissance man. A dilemma confronts the writer: how to ground the Immortalist thesis on hard biomedical evidence, and at the same time make allowances for this evidence becoming obsolete overnight. Developments reinforcing the central argument are cast up day after day. When the times come to draw on this carefully assembled material, the daring speculations that almost unthinkably a heart may be transplanted, or that DNA will someday be synthesized, 3/4 of it may have turned into old news. In 1962, the Saturday Review, with considerable excitement, published a futuristic article in the field of medicine. Its source was a newly translated volume, Experimental Transplantation of Vital Organs by V.P. Demirov. In a special section inserted at press time for the issue of SR, the magazine reported that Soviet scientist Demirkov foresees resuscitation of human bodies whose brains are past recovery, and maintenance of those cavities in a vegetable state of life for whatever lengths of time may pass until the healthy organs are needed for transplantation to the bodies of people still possessed of their mental faculties. Author Demikrov believes that through experimentation, man will learn to modify the natural immunity, which now causes one body to slough off any tissue not its own. Only 5 years after this things to come forecast, in the August 1967 number of the Atlantic Monthly, Roy L. Walford, professor of pathology at UCLA and an advisor to the National Institutes of Health in Transplantation and Immunology, was predicting it is a good bet that the scientific problems of organ transplantation are nearly solved. Professor Walford, a medical doctor and leader in aging studies, recently engaged in research at the Laboratory d'Immunohematologie at Hôpital Saint Louis in France. Looking ahead to a tremendous demand by sick persons for all kinds of fresh and functional human organs. Unfortunately, if present methods of procurement are adhered to, there will simply not be enough organs to go around. Perhaps a third of future humanity will be at some time during the course of their lives in need of an organ transplant. His perception was borne out soon enough. We had not only the news of Dr. Bernard's successful heart transplant, but also the headlines like these. Blood cells may be grown in laboratory. Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, 14th of the 9th, 67, by George Getzer. Blood cells to replace diseased or damaged ones may someday be grown artificially in laboratories, according to the Gaston Matelli, Associate Professor of Microbiology at University of Southern California School of Medicine. Researchers transplant dog's brain. New York Post, 3rd of the 10th, 67. Las Vegas, Nevada, AP. 3 Cleveland researchers have described the first successful transplant of a brain from one animal to another. The dead body and the living brain. Luck, 28th of the 11th, 1607, by Orana Felici. Professor Robert White, Director, Department of Neurosurgery at Cleveland Metropolitan General Hospital. We can transfer the head of a man onto the trunk of another man. I only know that today we could keep Einstein's brain alive and make it function normally. The only way to transfer the brain of a man to another man is to transfer the entire head. I could cool the head and keep it alive while the body is dying and free of its arteries, and feed it blood through the T cannula, and then separate the head. It could be accomplished now with existing techniques. DeBarkey sees brain transfers. New York Daily News, 13th of the 12th, 67. It is possible that the doctors of the future will be able to transplant not only hearts from one person to another, but also heart and lung system, even the brain, Dr. Michael E. DeBakey, the noted heart surgeon, said last night. Bernard predicts animal heart use. New York Times, 3rd of the 3rd, 68, by Walter Sullivan. Dr. Christian N. Bernard, the South African surgeon who performed the first human heart transplant 3 months ago, predicted today that animal hearts would be used extensively to replace those of heart patients. PA doctors study banking of organs, New York Post, 31st of the 3rd, 68, Philadelphia AP. A University of Pennsylvania team has started a 3-day study in hopes to may someday lead to the storage of human organs for transplanting. Dr. Harrington B. Lear, the plastic surgeon at the University Hospital, said the ultimate goal was the establishment of banks, just like blood banks, of human hearts, lungs, kidneys, parathyroid glands, and gastrointestinal tracts. A move to legalize removal of organs. New York Post, 16th of the 4th, 68. Los Angeles, a UCLA law professor has proposed a legal change which would make the removal of organs after death as routine and socially acceptable as burial. Professor Jesse Dukenminer Jr. predicted that his proposed new statute would solve many of the medical, ethical, and legal problems of organ transplantation. One feels here a gathering momentum of discovery. Practically every week reports of new achievements and larger versions come into print. Physicians say lung transplant will be successfully developed. New York Times, 2nd of the 6th, 68, by Richard D. Lyons. Despite the recent failure in Scotland of an attempted lung transplant, a number of physicians believe that such operations will become increasingly more frequent and eventually successful. World's 20th heart transplant is undertaken at a hospital here, New York Times, 2nd of the 6th, 68, by Lawrence Van Gelder. Surgeons at New York Hospital sought yesterday to transplant into an unidentified man the heart of a Bronx janitor who died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in the head. At the same time, kidneys from the same donor were being transplanted to 2 young men. 62D transplant patient is fine. New York Post, 22nd of the 10th, 68. Milwaukee Reuters. A 6-man team completed the world's 62nd heart transplant last night, and doctors say the recipient is doing fine. I'm looking at a wire service photo of Dr. Bleiberg, complete with his young heart, passing his football with some visiting ruggers. But now, a few days later, he contracts severe hepatitis, and fluid has collected near the heart. A day more, and he is better. Still, since the immunoreactions within his body have been depressed by drugs in order to prevent rejection of the life-saving heart, Dr. Bleiberg's defenses defenses against dangerous bacteria have obviously been reduced too. Does this mean that receivers of new hearts and kidneys must be condemned always to exist on the edge of infection, as haemophilia victims live with the ever-present fear of scratches and cuts? Never always, and in this instance perhaps not even for very long, because anti-transplant factor isolated. Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, 24th of the 5th, 68, by Victor Cohn. Washington. Human transplantation, antigen, and the chemical that triggers the response that causes rejection of a transplant from another person has been isolated. The achievement could open the way to preventing the rejection of grafted hearts and other organs. Clearly, the problems of rejection in organ transplants will eventually be solved. When this is accomplished, not merely a few added years, but an extended leases on life will be made possible by transplant surgery. At this point, we may well recoil from certain possibilities. For instance, if Dr. Robert White is on the right track, if the graft of an old head, and hence presumably an old consciousness, on a young body can be accomplished now with existing techniques, we would seem to be shockingly and embarrassingly close to indefinite life extension by means of head transfer. At first, a surgical feat of this kind seems a terrible idea, belonging gruesomely and almost laughingly to the horror film or comic strip. Yet, if Dr. White and other surgeons can do what he says can be done, sooner or later, somebody is going to try, and it will be done, and it will work. There appears to be a law of familiarity breeding acceptance. What seems horrendous and unthinkable to one generation will not shock another. One of the things that people like most is to just stay alive, whatever the price, writes Dr. Walford. To avoid facing individual death, they will look with quite a new light at the problems involved in obtaining organs from accident victims without permission, at suicide, capital punishment, or euthanasia. In the past, any indication, moral, and important aesthetic objections to the new surgery will moderate over the years, and quickly. But once again, just as this has been decided, we are overtaken by new developments. It may be that we are concerning ourselves with an already obsolete approach to organ replacement, at least of the heart. Machine replacing the heart foreseen. New York Times, 12th of the 6th, 68. Washington, June 11th, UPI. Scientists at the Atomic Energy Commission believe that within 10 years the human heart will be replaced by a machine. Before then, they hope to develop a 7-pound atomic-powered motor that would be installed in the abdomen and serve as a pump for failing hearts. The project could be the most dramatic development in atomic energy in history. Dr. Glenn T. Seaborg, chairman of the AEC, said when he testified before a closed session of a House Appropriations Subcommittee. And the bioengineers have a vision all of their own. A successor to organ transplants. Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, 21st of the 6th, 68, by George Getz. Los Angeles. Heart transplants will never will be the medical answer to the human problem of heart failure, according to bioengineer Silas Braley of the Dow Chemical Center for Aid to Medical Research says the supply of strong hearts will never meet demand. Braley was a speaker and panelist at the 75th annual meeting of the American Society for Engineering Education. He said, "Our artificial organs have more medical promise for the future than transplants. I'd guess that at least 30,000 people are walking about right now with artificial valves of plastic or metal embedded in their hearts," Braley said. Artificial hearts seen as our number 2 industry. New York Post, 19th of the 8th, 68. San Francisco, Reuters. A noted heart surgeon says a federally sponsored secret report showed that the manufacture, insertion, and servicing of artificial hearts would be the second largest industry in the US by 1988. Dr. Donald C. Harrison, chief of Cardiology Division of Stanford University Medical School and a member of the Stanford heart transplant team, quoted the report as saying only the manufacture and servicing of cars will be a bigger business. Dr. Cooley planning an artificial heart. New York Times, 28th of the 9th, 68. Houston, September 27th, UPI. Dr. Denton Cooley, who has done more heart transplants than any other surgeon, said today he plans to build an artificial heart because of the scarcity of donors. Dr. Cooley said he hoped to build an artificial heart in 5 years. Whether of flesh or plastic, new organs for the worn-out body may not be so hard to obtain after all. Still, another approach, genetic engineering, offers the prospect, in the words of Dr. Anton Schwartz of the Dow Chemical Company, we may leap the barrier of organ transplants with genes to command. It has been predicted that animal breeds histocompatible to man could be developed, making available an unlimited supply of replacement organs. As long ago as 1960, in a speech before a medical conference at Lahore, Pakistan, Professor V. Kovanov of the First Chemical Institute of Moscow speculated that such transplants from animals could help banish death altogether. Now, more conservatively, we can foresee men replacing themselves. The Brave New World of Genetic Control, New York Post, 20th of the 4th, 68, by Bill Burris. Homegrown hearts, limbs, and livers to replace old ones, new teeth, hair, and eyes, an endless supply of new brain cells to wipe out senility. A vegetable breeding of 1 million human beings from body cells, so that all the identical twins to the donor. They are all identical twins to the donor. A group of eminent scientists told a New York audience recently that the era of genetic control is near, that the evolution of a super race is not too far from our grasp. This conference on the far reach of science, sponsored by Life magazine, was moderated by Dr. Lee Dubridge, president of the California Institute of Technology, and recently appointed scientific advisor to President Nixon. Robert Schinsheimer told the audience, mostly business executives, modern biology is now poised to provide a new and profound approach to understanding the nature of man. With that understanding will come wholly new powers to alter man's very being. Many of these new powers will derive from a single achievement, artificial reproduction of the deoxyribonucleic DNA. I'm not reading DNA, it's full name. Sorry, fuck that. The DNA whose coiled threads control not only all of us, but all of life. At least this species has performed the feat of reproducing its own substance. Or, in terms of our theme, the pretender to the throne of the gods has moved toward genetic control over his future divinity. The reproduction of DNA was a collaborative effort at Caltech and Stanford. We had made then in a test tube the DNA which could serve as the progenitor of an indefinitely long chain of progeny virus from this day on throughout time. Dr. Shinsheimer explained at the Life Conference in New York, the big significance is that the infectivity of the copy proves the accuracy of the whole process, and that this process is open-ended. In principle, it can be applied to any DNA, from a virus or bacteria, an amoeba, a mouse, or a man. The audience also heard this from California Institute of Technology biologist Dr. James Bonner. There is nothing to prevent you from taking 2 body cells from a donor and growing identical twins having the same genetic constitution of the donor. There is nothing to prevent you from making 1,000. There is nothing in principle to prevent us from doing that same thing ultimately in man himself, and growing any number of genetically identical people from individuals who have what we assess as highly desirable genetic characteristics. In the future, we could take a single cell and reset the genetic program to any desired point to make that cell or a group of cells turn into, say, a new organ, a replacement organ, or a new liver. Or say, go to a doctor and he says, well, I think your heart isn't so good now. Maybe we better start growing you a new one. Or in 2 or 3 years it will be grown and we can plumb it in. The genetic age is unlikely to announce itself with a bang. A biologist has said, practiced in private and in secret on individual genes of individual persons, it will slip imperceptibly into our lives. Imperceptibly, too, we are changing the terms of the human contract. Men are not sitting still for death anymore, and the river that will take us out of time flows faster than we know. Through transplants alone, the immortality hunter is learning how to replace his energies. With the ability to insert new organs into a sick or aging body, he finds at least a portion of youth again. The heart he receives may come from an animal or a human cavalier, may be flesh or plastic, or some years from now with the genetically ordered cells that can be grown in vitro into his specific replacement organs. The equivalent of his own younger cells may be grafted into him with no fear of tissue rejection. New heart, kidneys, lungs, and pancreas. These must almost necessarily add up to a newer man with a fresh expectation of years. But organ replacement may be a crude and clumsy way to prolongate the prolongation of life. There are many others. For example, Dr. Holger Heiden of the University of Gothenburg in Sweden has injected DNA from the brains of young laboratory animals into the brains of aging animals, apparently stimulating protein production in the brain cells. He believes that research may evolve a technique increasing an aging human brain's activity in this manner. With Dr. Bronner's forecast in mind, it is certainly conceivable that such a transfer of youth could be accomplished periodically by injections of one's own DNA newly grown in a test tube. But latest developments of this sort must be seen as relatively unimportant to the Immortalist argument. What matters is the accelerating swiftness of medical discovery. To judge the rate at which we have been moving forwards, look back. Beginning with Professor Welford's article, the advances cited in this chapter cover a period of only a little more than a year. In another year or two, they will vanish from public memory, obscured by new experiments and visions. Moving towards the end of time, the river of research overwhelms and renders obsolete every individual discovery along the way, granting humanity's inevitable passage. The obsolescence of this or that laboratory breakthrough could not matter less. In fact, it may best serve our argument deliberately not to keep this aging evidence up to date, let it grow obsolete. The more outdated our evidence becomes, even within a year, the more clearly will be dramatized how far we have advanced beyond the point from which the Immortalist took off. So, we will leave all old news here, just as it was when it seemed so fresh and startling. The attack on death has not been organized properly, for the simple reason that we have not dared denounce it as an overall objective, still unconsciously afraid of the antagonizing of gods, in this regard the medical profession being as superstitious as the rest of us. We cannot bear to speak the word, let the hubris out, that we have a secret intent to do away with death entirely. Having no word, we have no program. Fiefdoms of one specialty or another attempt to control the allocation of expenditures in their fields of study. Unfortunately, this will always be a part of a political allocation, since everybody wants to score and show off to the gods. In biomedical research, as in any other line of work, every association of specialists naturally tries to obtain all the funds possible to advance research in its particular area. Are not all medical specialists tactily joined in the fight against death? May this not be assumed? The Immortalist reply is that it most certainly cannot be assumed. Rather, the modestly hidden intent is in danger of being buried under our river of papers. We appear to be lost in and intimidated in the torrent of our own data. Everybody pursues little, special goals, vague forecasts abound. Scientists of the Rand Corporation have predicted a 50-year increase in our life expectancy in 50 years, but from day to day, researchers tend to work along established lines, take refuge in narrow professionalism, and never forget to contribute to the pension plan. Lacking here is any sense of a grand mission, such as those that animated the Manhattan Project or the National Space Program, capturing atomic energy and reaching for the moon. You know what you are after. With the problem of meaningless annihilation having become so urgent in our time, threatening worldwide violence and madness, the simple pronouncement of a final war against death would be the biomedical arts, the frame of the dedication they need. On a working level, we require a central planning authority to take through the climactic assault on death. It would first of all put a stop to the inefficient duplication of research. The Commission would organize study teams as a general staff deploys an expenditory force. In particular, it is hoped that an Immortality Commission of this nature would recommend wide-ranging research expenditures to be spent on the study of the aging process itself, about which little is known, and an area of exploration to which relatively few medical research dollars have been allocated. For the study of aging, conducted independently of the study of specific diseases, may lead more quickly to death's secret place. The war against death will be an enormously complex undertaking. Even a glimpse into our own cells reveals a wilderness to be conquered. For one thing, we seem to be up against an evolutionary plan which calls for the individual to grow, procreate, and die so that the species can go on. This appears to be our assignment, and nothing else. Hence, in determining to live on, we are resisting a program laid out for us, and probably for all metazoan creatures. Yet, we need not be intimidated. As will be seen, the master plan is not impenetrable. Death can be held off. We can look forward to renewed leases on life. But what about the transitional generations who still must die? Can any hope at all be offered to them? I'm only speaking out of practical hope, not of the promises of salvation held out by half-mad evangelists, or cool, pinstripe preachers of Madison Square Garden. Chapter 18. The Cryonics Underground. So we don't have long to wait before we shall know how to freeze the human organism without injuring it. When that happens, we shall have to replace cemeteries by dormitories, so that each of us may have a chance for immortality that the present state of knowledge seems to promise. Professor Jean Rostand. This is not a hobby or conversation piece. It is the principal activity of this phase of our lives. It is the struggle for survival. Drive a used car if the cost of a new one interferes. Divorce your wife if she will not cooperate. Save your money, get another job, and save more money. Sometimes a fool will blunder through, but don't count on it. The universe has no malice, but neither has it mercy, and a miss is as good as a mile. Robert C. W. Ettinger. Okay, that's a very French title. I'm gonna just skip the title and then read the author. Dr. Gilmere Roy, the Association Cryonics Francois. Underground societies are being set up all over the United States to propagate and facilitate this new form of dying to live again, wrote correspondent John Campbell in the London Evening Standard, September 6th, 1967. I have just visited my local chapter, situated in a large, dark Victorian house deep in Brooklyn. The atmosphere was not clinical. 3 young men and a girl sat in an office piled with papers. The group turned out not to be doctors, but a lawyer, an industrial designer, and a trade writer. I felt, curiously enough, as if I were among a bunch of anarchists. Not anarchists, but certainly revolutionaries. The plotters visited by Miss Campbell belonged to the Cryonics Society of New York, Incorporated. 6 cryonics groups in the United States and 1 in France have this mission, to encourage and promote freezing of the newly dead rather than burying or incinerating them. In order that these individuals, still regarded as such, may be revived at some time in the future when technological means have been developed. In theory, the promised resurrection from cold storage will take place when 1. Damage done to the cells and tissues while the suspended body is being frozen, unavoidable at present, can be repaired by methods as yet unknown. 2. Techniques of thawing have been developed to prevent injuries to the cells in the rewarming process. 3. Remedies for the terminal illness or combination of deteriorative effects that ended the patient's life have been found, and ideally, 4. Ways to arrest, stabilize, and eventually reverse the aging process are uncovered by future research. In Greek, cryos means icy cold. Cryobiology has to do with the relatively new science that studies and utilizes the effects of low temperatures on living material. Specialists may belong to the Society of Cryobiology, which publishes the journal Cryobiology. Cryogenetics refers to the branch of physics dealing with low temperatures. Cryonics is something else. The term coined by Carl Werner, a young designer of underwater structures and a freeze-wait-reanimate pioneer, to denote the preservation of the human body by freezing or supercooling to prevent the finality of death. The name was first given to the Cryonics Society of New York. Today, according to Robert Ettinger, the prophet and leader of the freezing movement, we use cryonics as a blanket to cover all the disciplines and programs centered on human cold storage. Ettinger, a physicist whose book, The Prospect of Immortality, inspired what may now, without irony, be called the cryonics faith, has regarded cryobiology as the startling discipline, and said he was told by an officer of the National Society that only a half-dozen men in the country and a dozen in the world were engaged in it full-time. Some cryobiologists are skeptical about his cause. One scientist has this to say: the cryonic societies around the world are often rather shady organizations whose partial purpose is to get money to freeze people before the techniques are really worked out. They do often have available a certain amount of information obtained through publications of more legitimate societies, but it's often blown up to be more than it is. Local physicians, who are not always so bright, are sometimes sucked into these societies to give them an appearance of scientific approval. But such a judgment fails to take into account the obsessive and emotional determination to hold off death that drives the cryonics people. Several cryobiologists have contributed to the literature of the movement. They appear to share the central faith that death is evil, and that by freezing our remains we have some chance of saving ourselves. Most faiths, orthodox or secular, tend to encourage enterprise at the fringes, the selling of holy relics, or the psychedelic jewelry. We could say, for instance, that the multi-billion-dollar life insurance business serves as a commercial development of the Christian spirit. Certainly a cash profit can be made out of decent instincts to protect loved ones, etc. Some critics feel that life insurance extracts damaging sums from struggling family men who might use these amounts to enrich their lives in some better way. Now, the cryonics movement may at some point have vast commercial possibilities. Science fiction writer Friedrich Paul estimates the potential profits from freezing and storage in trillions of dollars. At present, churches, life insurance companies, and mortuaries, the cryonics people expect to cooperate with these institutions, can count on grossing a virtual infinity of recipients from death. Will they go about this honestly? The answer depends on the nature and quality of your faith. Behind the production of more ornate and longer-lasting caskets is the idea that when resurrection teams come around you, had better be in a good enough condition to get up and walk. A super stainless coffin will make a better impression on the officials than an old crate. The cost of burning candles, reciting masses, maintaining eternal flames, laying wreaths on graves, and all that sort of thing derives from the implicit promise, whether or not dressed in symbolic terms, that you can come back. The cryonic societies do not go so far as to make this promise. What they do maintain is that freezing immediately after the pronouncement of death offers a fair bet for survival. In Ettinger's phrase, a chance of debatable magnitude, but nevertheless some chance. And as of now, the only chance. Or as Curtis Henderson, president of the New York Society, said, no matter how slim the chances are today, they are better than the worms or the crematorium are going to give you. To arrest our impending decay in frozen capsules, and hold mortal humanity in a suspended state, actually planning for a bodily resurrection can hardly avoid being a revolutionary concept. Yet, it sometimes appears to be a limited sort of revolution. Ettinger, for example, seems not to visualize the program shaking present-day social and business structures. Thus, he has expressed the belief that no real vested interests could be damaged by it. Not religion, not morticians, not cemeterians, not physicians, certainly not lawyers or businessmen. All of these, in fact, can benefit from it. It is true, however, that some people may imagine their business interests threatened, and that many will bristle at the psychological threat, the undermining of their carefully constructed philosophical castles of sand. We have a curiously disturbing vision. Piled up bodies in frozen dormitories wait for rebirth. Outside life goes on much as before, except that instead of burying our dead, we stow them away. In hundreds of laboratories, scientists are working to liberate the race from its mortal condition, while the suspended bodies multiply in capsules all over the world. Prudently insured men and women walk about, half liberated from their fear of extinction, hoping. In 1947, Ettinger came across the report of experiments performed by Dr. Jean Rostand, in which the French biologist successfully preserved frog sperm using glycerol as a cryoprotective agent to prevent freezing damage. He instantly saw the application of this new development in preserving human life, having our bodies frozen immediately after death, with the hope that they could be revived at some point. But for more than 13 years after this insight, he made no attempt to pursue the matter. I thought surely, before long, better qualified people would take up the idea, he explained in an interview with Saul Kent, editor of Cryonics Reports. When no one did, he made a tentative start. Finally, in 1960, I felt I had to do something on my own, he told Kent. I summarized the thesis on one page, emphasizing the life insurance aspects, and sent this to a couple of 100 people selected at random from Who's Who. Only a few responded, and it was clear that a long dissertation was needed to make such a revolutionary proposition with so many apparent difficulties seem plausible. While an instructor in physics on the faculty of Wayne State University in Michigan, more recently he has taught at Highland Park College, Ettinger wrote the first draft of his proposal for a cryogenic approach to eternal life, and in 1962 had it privately printed. A revised version of The Prospect of Immortality was published by Doubleday in 1964. Although the book went into a second edition, it did not make an exceptionally strong showing considering the boldness of Ettinger's theme. The literary and philosophical establishments ignored it. Despite a favourable preface by Jean Rostand, who had belatedly read and approved the thesis originally developed from news of his experiments, the journal Science refused to take the work seriously on the grounds that successful freezing and thawing of a complex organism such as the human body was beyond reasonable hope for a long time to come. Ettinger considers this view utterly irrelevant. The cryogenically suspended are not going anywhere. His counter-arguments runs and wait virtually to eternity until the proper techniques are developed. In October 1965, science editor Albert Rosenfeld noted in Life, "Will man direct his own evolution?" that, although Ettinger's proposals are highly controversial and most scientists refuse to take them seriously, the marvel is that they do have a valid base and that they have struck an instantaneous public nerve. The argument for cryogenic interment now changed to cryonic suspension for public relations reasons, proceeds from the fact that men do not die all at once, but rather succumb to clinical, biological, and then cellular death, in that order. Clinical death arrives first, confirmed by the cessation of heartbeat and breathing. Within 5 to 8 minutes, deterioration normally sets in, culminating in biological death, defined by Dr. A.S. Parks as the state from which resuscitation of the body as a whole is impossible by current known means. Ettinger has extended this definition slightly, describing biological death as just a critical malfunction incurable by present means. In his own book, he finds it implicit in Dr. Park's definition that if we use extreme freezing to prevent deterioration, sooner or later, currently known means will be adequate, and the body will no longer be regarded as dead. Finally, in cellular death, all the cells degenerate, suffering irreversible damage. The critical period for the expiring individual whose heart and breathing have just stopped is between clinical and biological death. This will always be a time of emergency for suspension teams, since measures needed to preserve the body must be taken quickly. At the point of clinical and legal death, writes Ettinger, in most cases the body, including the brain, is still at least 99% alive, since only relatively few of the cells have failed. Hence, if we keep the patient out of the clutches of the traditional undertaker and promptly give him instead to a mortician or physician trained in the procedures of cryonics, he can be frozen by special measures that minimize freezing injury and preserved indefinitely for his not very dead condition, with the hope of future survival and rejuvenation. Under the best possible conditions, that is, in the right hospital or at home with the proper equipment and a crew of specialists nearby, quick freezing can certainly be accomplished in a manner that will preserve severe cellular damage during the brief time of clinical death. Also, when the body is placed under low temperatures, the period before biological breakdown occurs will be prolonged. Unhappily, very large numbers of people do not and will not die in bed or at a location within 5 minutes of cryonics equipment. At the first annual Cryonics Conference in New York, March 1968, the society showed a film by Carl Werner depicting a simulated cryonics medical alert. A phone call brought the freezer technicians into action like firemen. A truck careened through the streets. The body was hurriedly but carefully packed into its resting place, where it would ultimately be stored at minus 197 degrees Celsius, the temperature of liquid nitrogen. But such a procedure requires the best of luck to be successful. The man who has purchased an insurance policy to cover this final moment will almost certainly not obtain full value if, say, he suffers a fatal heart attack while on a summer fishing trip. Even if the end should come in the middle of traffic in New York or Chicago, the likelihood of his being transported across town in time to reach the cold storage would be forbiddingly small, unless emergency cryo-capsule parlors were placed like pharmacies on every block. To deal with such emergencies, the cryonics societies have utilized the services of the Medical Alert Foundation, A collect call to medical alert will obtain the telephone numbers of specialists in the area prepared to administer treatment to the person that has just died. For $5, the subscriber receives a stainless steel bracelet, a wallet information card, and an emergency telephone number. On the bracelet, he can have stamped urgent instructions. If I am dead, call quickly, or call collect. The designated phone number, which would be that of a Cryonic Society headquarters. Additionally, lines for 50 cents apiece could be provided to supplement information. If dead, cool body with ice, especially head, while giving artificial respiration and cardiac massage. Call for help. A wallet information card gives additional instructions. The record of present-day city dwellers in answering live outcries for help has been dubious enough. Frantic instructions from the clinically dead sprawled on the sidewalk would seem even less likely to receive the attention they deserve, even with a collect phone call guaranteed. What can be the point of pretending otherwise? Unless a police, fire, or ambulance unit happens to be in a short distance away, the departing individual is going to be well into biological death before reaching cold storage. Ettinger has been well aware of this problem, and the prospect of immortality contains a brief section on the limits of delay in treatment. Earlier, he prepares the structure of faith essential to the cryonics movement. Its first principle is Ettinger's conviction, which cannot be abandoned. The phrase irreversible damage is used too cavalierly, and really means incapable of being reversed by methods so far employed. He concedes that the brain may certainly suffer irreversible damage from anoxia, the deprivation of oxygen when blood circulation stops. But then, having more or less acknowledged this, he gradually retreats from the unpleasant brute fact by expressing doubt whether, after all, it really is so. The cryonics faith is built up on a structure of conditionals. Italics, except for any, are added. While the brain cells do indeed die more quickly than the cells of any other kind, we must not therefore come to a hasty pessimistic conclusion. As already indicated, it may well be that the more important parts and functions of these cells are not so delicate as the cell as a whole. It is also possible that hope should not be given up so long as any body cells show life. If the skin, for example, is still alive, then there is still some chance that the brain cells are also alive, albeit damaged. Removal of the excess lactic acid, adjustment of the fluid balance, and so on, by techniques at the disposal of future science, may find them as good as new. Therefore, unless the body has been exposed for a hopelessly long period, the enthusiasts of cryonics movement believe that a handful of cells can be saved by the freezing effort. The gamble is worthwhile. Looking far into the future, Ettinger imagines that if brute force methods are necessary, it is not inconceivable that huge surgeon machines, working 24 hours a day for decades or even centuries, will tenderly restore the frozen brains cell by cell, or even molecule by molecule, in critical areas. In September 1967, 74-year-old Marie Phelps Sweet, Miss Russ LeCroix van Norden, follower of Dr. Ettinger, was frozen by the members of the Cryonic Society of California between 2 and 3 days after her unexpected and unattended death in a Santa Monica hotel. During much of the waiting period, she was stored in a mortuary at 30 degrees Fahrenheit, by cryonic standard a relatively high temperature. Acknowledging these unfavorable circumstances, Ettinger maintained, yet no one can say for certain that Marie's chance is zero or even small, and no one can prove that truly irreversible damage has occurred. Miss Sweet has not been able to make provision for her cryonic suspension. This meant that the Cryonic Society had to go through with the perfusion and storage of the body at its own expense. The cryonics reports In cryonics reports, Robert Nelson, author of We Froze the First Man, noted that cost of storage, dry ice replacement, and incidental maintenance is approximately $75 a week. Because of the prohibitive cost, we cannot maintain indefinitely. Permanent storage arrangements must be made. Asked, why did you freeze her? Nelson replied, as one of the pioneers in the cryonics revolution, and in view of her intense desire to be frozen under any conditions, we felt we should honor her wishes. The decision severely tested members of the cryonics movement, since they had not only to act on their convictions, but to pay for them, and possibly continue to pay. This proved not only to be awkward and difficult, but also involved a test of conscience. A cryonics reports editorial pointed out that a pattern of placing full responsibility for the dead upon the living cannot be perpetuated. It is simply too expensive, physically, emotionally, and morally. This expensive spirit may be seen in Robert Ettinger's appeal to the membership. She did not make adequate arrangements, and so lies stricken and helpless, with only the will and resources of her relatives and friends to save her from the mindless enemy. There are the intangible, but paramount matters of morale and conscience. Marie is not just a statistic, she is one of us. For our own integrity as individuals and as organizations, we must acknowledge our moral responsibility. A friend and comrade simply cannot be abandoned. Today, Marie Sweet rests in an interim frozen shelter with a permanent disposition of her body still undetermined. The eminent University of Minnesota surgeon, Dr. Richard Lillihei, has predicted Daniel Green, the National Observer, 29th of the 4th, 68, ultimately we'll be freezing organs and keeping them in some kind of bank. If we can reach the stage of freezing organs for transplants, there is no reason why we can't go further and freeze and thaw a whole person. At the first cryonics conference, Dr. Amrand Karau Jr., the Medical College of Georgia, and Ralph Hamilton of the University of Pennsylvania lectured on developments in cryobiology and the state of the freezing art. I think Dr. Karau has said, in general, cryobiologists would have to concede that freezing human form and bringing it back to life is a real possibility. And Dr. Hamilton, theoretically, if you can preserve one cell by freezing and thawing, you should be able to preserve any aggregate of cells. But most researchers agree that those who have been placed in cryonic suspension to date will stay dead. Dr. Roy Walford, for example, believes that in spite of all difficulties, the problem of freezing organs with minimum damage will probably be solved in the next 5 years, and that if an organ like a heart or kidney or liver can be so kept, so doubtlessly can a whole man. Unfortunately, the corpses already frozen in liquid nitrogen will doubtlessly never be revived. They are literally, in a protein sense, like cooked eggs. It's unlikely we'll ever be able to uncook an egg. To which a young biologist has replied, given enough time, of course we'll learn how to uncook an egg. Time enough remains the key to the faith of all cryonics believers. They stress that the temporarily lifeless sleepers' time is virtually stopped, and if need be, they can wait through centuries until all eggs in all sciences have been uncooked. For this reason, the matter of thawing damage does not disturb them. Obviously, they point out people are not going to be rewarmed until such a time as the formation of ice crystals and gas bubbles in and around cells and other adverse reactions have been dealt with by cryobiologists of the future. The cryonics faith can point to a growing body of evidence suggesting that, in purely technical terms, the deep freeze gambler may not be up against such long odds. Much is made of the experiment conducted by Professor Ismond Suda and Dr. K. Kido and Dr. C. Adachi, in which a cat's brain was perfused with glycerol, cooled to minus 20 degrees, and stored for 203 days. After rewarming, an encephalograph reading was registered indicating almost normal electrical brainwave activity. At this stage, wrote the Kobe University scientists, we wish to conclude that the brain cells are not especially vulnerable to lack of oxygen. It appears that even nerve cells of the brain can survive and be revived after long-term storage under special circumstances. We may therefore assume that consciousness will hold intact. May we therefore assume that consciousness will hold intact under extreme cooling? Possibly, although Dr. Caro raises the question whether the encephalograph reading represented organized cerebral function, i.e. survival of coherent activity, may not be provided. Even so, the pseudo-experiment appears to be one of the many signs pointing towards towards mastery of the freezing art. Dr. Charles E. Huggins of Harvard Medical School reports golden hamsters being revived after 5 hours and 20 minutes at freezing point of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Another experiment has shown that memory may not only continue but actually improve in laboratory rats after they have been cooled nearly to freezing point. The University of Oregon surgeon, Dr. Stanley W. Jacob, found that after being placed under hypothermia, while white rats, for no known reason, solved mazes with fewer errors than their litter mates, whose vital functions had not been disturbed. Today, writes Dr. Caro, it is relatively easy to freeze-preserve life in single cells, cell suspensions, and small specimens of tissue. Frozen blood and sperm cells may be kept for months or years, and so far only coroner's skin bone marrow cells are being held at the National Naval Medical Center, the world's leading bank for frozen tissues. Underrated, the cryonics movement has gone ahead. And undeterred, the cryonics movement has gone ahead. On January 12th, 1967, 73-year-old Dr. James H. Bedford, a retired psychology professor who died of cancer in Los Angeles, became the first whole man to be frozen under favorable conditions. Dr. Bedford was perfused with a DMCO, then packed in dry ice, and eventually came to rest in Phoenix, Arizona, inside a frozen capsule. This event, which the cryonics movement regards as its first significant breakthrough, both technologically and in terms of public relations, has been described in excitement and vivid fashion in Nelson's book We Froze the First Man. Nelson's account itself is perfused with jubilance and the thrill of revolution. It also contains elements of knockabout comedy, disconcerting greed for publicity, and perhaps understandable family hysteria, as a crew of zealots, apostles of future immortality, struggle to save the body, and therefore the soul of the man on ice. Being frozen is not cheap. At present rates, policies accounting to at least $20,000 are needed to cover the father and mother in perpetuity, and this means $20,000 less for their heirs. Without faith, the arrangement seems cold and unsatisfying. To the families left behind, the suspended bodies of their parents may likely to represent a dead selfishness embodied in an endless future. Families who feel this way will not want to share the faith or keep it, and the tendency among many will be to obstruct frozen internment. Even so, the expectation of the cryonics groups is that freezing will soon become routine and not confined to the aged. For example, the parental permission in September 1968, the Cryonics Society of New York froze the body of a 24-year-old student who had died of complications following surgery. The young man's body was placed in a capsule of liquid nitrogen at Washington Memorial Park Cemetery in Coram, LI. Members of the society regard him as a frozen friend. Readers of The Prospect of Immortality will find that the economic, social, and most important, the emotional consequences of the author's program have only been touched on, sometimes in a neglected fashion. For instance, Ettinger assumes that over the centuries, cryonic suspension will be carried out within the framework of capitalism. This leads him to the calculation that a person frozen in our time, taking with him conservation investments yielding only 3% interest, will accumulate $7 million during a sleep of 300 years. This money is real, he adds, but I see no reason to expect future generations to be jealous of the bank accounts and financial influence of the Frozen. The superstition, especially when made in these times of upheaval, that money is going to lie around for 3 centuries, with a bank account growing just as it does now, and the world 3 centuries beyond us will have such a unit of exchange as money, illustrates how the cryonics people sometimes advance their views in a vacuum. Edinger briefly mentions, but does not seem entirely to realize what events would follow if the potential immortality became, in a physical, observable way, the privilege of the economically elect. Consider a freezer program with affluent white people, their life insurance policies paid up, lying in neat rows waiting for the trumpet of science to return them to life, while the struggling black and brown masses continue to die as they always have. Do the cryonics partisans dare dream of the black and brown reaction to this final injustice? Not only are the exploiters oppressing us now, but they are planning to come back and sit on the world all over again. And on top of that, they will not even die. This state of affairs would obviously be unendurable, and would result, at the very least, in the unprotected people hosing down and melting the iced-in sanctuaries. The cryonics groups, neither heartless nor stupid, know that social security would be their best administrative framework for their program, with an equal chance of resurrection for everyone. But they see no alternative to private enterprise. Clearly, since no government, that of the United States or any other, is about to make freezing possible for everyone, the rich, regrettably, will have to take the lead, allow themselves to be suspended in liquid nitrogen, set the example. Reasonable enough, perhaps, yet the question remains whether the deprived masses would put up with death no longer being democratic for more than a month or two. Robert Edinger recognizes, as he must, the already severe problems of overpopulation would be exacerbated by the additions of millions stowed away in cryocapsules waiting to return. He argues, not unconvincingly, that with or without freezers, there will soon be an increased longevity, and later an indefinite lifespan, and that since solutions must be found anyhow, we may as well make them good enough so that our own generation, and those immediately succeeding, can share the golden age. He then estimates that if it takes 300 years to reach immortality, then there will be 40 billion people to revive and relocate. Even these immense numbers can be accommodated, he believes, citing the opinion of University of Chicago professor Richard L. Meyer that as many as 50 billion could survive on the globe, given improved industrial and agricultural techniques, exploration and development of undersea areas, expanses of jungle, deserts, and currently infertile regions. Here Edinger seems uncharacteristically conservative. Indefinite extension of life may be much closer than 3 centuries away. Further, if it somehow becomes possible for millions to be placed in frozen vaults with eternity to wait, assuming the future generations kept faith with them, the populations of that time will surely have started to move out to other planets, or to artificial suburban satellite worlds, somewhat relieving our overcrowded condition. In the beginning, the strength of a revolutionary group is always difficult to estimate. Despite streams of leaflets, appearances on radio and television, and the like, the party, intending to change the world, when tracked down, may consist of 4 men and a dog sitting around a garage printing press. A local officer declares the combined membership of the cryonics movement, including relatively inactive associate members, to be 1,000 persons. The actual number may be considerably less, 100 or 2, or even a few score. But this would not be an insignificant figure. Christ, Hitler, and Castro each started with 12. The psychedelic movement, at least Timothy Leary's part of it, began in Newton, Massachusetts, with a single multifamily of about 24, including several children. The cryonics underground must have its resurrection when the first cryonaut comes back through the icicles after having been frozen for a number of hours or days. Only then will the world be changed. Until that time, or when, as with the space revolution, a dog returns from the unknown, the movement must perforce remain remain pre-revolutionary. A question lingers whether the cryonics package may not be too bulky, calling for too many hard-to-secure financial arrangements and too much hardware. In view of these and other difficulties, the cryonics way would turn out to be the most roundabout and least passable road to eternal life. An intensified drive to control the aging process seems far more promising. Along with this, basic research in cryobiology will certainly be essential and ought to be greatly increased. While not to be ruled out, the immortality now, put me in the capsule approach, may offer the smallest yield of all. The cryonics answer will certainly be that of both programs should immediately be put on a crash basis. Perhaps so. A national committee including poetists and artists as well as scientists and the usual churchmen and company presidents and conservative senator could be appointed to determine the most effective way to engineer our divinity. In the Immortalist view, freezing by itself ought to be seen as no more than a holding action. We are in search primarily of the new rhythms of living that will prevail beyond time. The refined way of making possible shifts of humanity, some sleeping, some walking, especially pending the colonization of space, will be through some sort of suspended life or hibernation, rather than the awkward and scientifically inelegant freezing and thawing of life forms. But the territory to be secured and administered by humanity must be that of the race's own physical body. Only by subduing the process that forces us to grow old will we be able to exempt ourselves from death, the lot of beasts, and assume the statues of gods, our rightful inheritance.